Hello, this is Jason with MathTutorDVD.com, and today we're going to continue learning about the TI-89 calculator, and we're going to start to talk about angles and using angles, degrees, radians, and things like that in terms of using that in our calculations. So we'll talk a little bit about sine, cosine, and tangent, but more importantly, we really want to talk about how this calculator handles radians and how should you input degrees and radians versus degrees, and how do you convert between radians and degrees. So really important material. You'll use this kind of stuff quite often. Now the first thing you need to know is that when you look at the screen, when you turn your calculator on, you're looking at the regular screen. Down here it says you're in Radian mode. So it's important for you to know that no matter what you're doing in your calculator, you can always look down here to see what mode you're in. What this means is that the calculator is currently in Radian mode. That means that any angles I put in here, any numbers that I put in here that are meant to be interpreted like an angle, for instance, if I stick an angle inside of a sine, it's going to assume that whatever number I type is a radian. So it's going to evaluate it that way. So to see that in action, if I put the sine on the stack here, and I want to take the sine of pi radians, pi is over here in blue, so put it like that and close it. What is the sine of pi? You should be able to figure that out in the unit circle, and the answer is 0. Likewise, I can go over here and put pi over 2. And so on the unit circle, that should be an answer of 1. Now it's evaluating it this way for me because it's assuming that the numbers that I put in here that are meant to be angles are already in radians, that whatever number I'm putting in there is a radian. Now if I go in here to the mode menu, I can change it out of radian mode. I can go fly out here and I can stick it in degrees. And when I do that and save all of this, it turns the calculator in degree mode. Now if I calculate the sine of pi over 2 again, I'm not going to get the answer of 1. In fact, it doesn't even really do that much. It just gives me an exact answer here. If I go and evaluate and make it turn this into a real decimal by doing the approximately equal down here, it's going to tell me that sine of pi over 2 is 0.027412. The reason is because it's assuming this is pi over 2 degrees. So if I take the number 3.14 and divide it by 2 here, which is pi over 2, that's 1.57. So basically what it did was evaluate the sine of 1.57 degrees. Now you should be able to know from your trig that 1.57 is a really small number of degrees. So it's a totally different number than pi over 2 radians. It's a totally different place in the unit circle. So that's why it evaluates things differently like that for us. Now another thing I'm going to tell you right here is that notice how it gave us, when we tried to do this guy, let me go back up on the stack and put this back on the stack. When we evaluated sine of pi over 2, it didn't really automatically convert it to a decimal. It just spit out really what we already knew, gave us what we put into the calculator. That's because it knew that the answer was going to be a lot of decimal places, and it's trying to keep it in exact form. If you remember back to the mode menu, we talked about that a little bit. If you go down here a little ways, you'll see exact/approximate. That's a setting that tells the calculator what to do. Right now it's in auto mode, which means it's trying to keep everything totally exact, except in some circumstances when it might decide to give us an approximate decimal. If that gives on your nerves a little bit, go ahead and change it over to approximate, and that's basically going to tell the calculator, don't try to keep it, quote, exact for me, just give me decimals all the time. So that's what it's going to do, and I went ahead and turned it off because when you're doing conversion of degrees, you really need to have it off in order to see what we're doing here. So we're in degree mode now. Let's go ahead and do cosine of something we understand in degrees. What is cosine of 90 degrees? From the unit circle, you should think about that, and you should realize that that's 0. Cosine of, cosine of 0 degrees, or let's do something different. Let's do 180 degrees. What's cosine of 180? On the unit circle, that should be back over on the left-hand side, so that's -1. These are all cosines and sines that you should more or less have memorized. So we've learned how to do that. Now when we put numbers into the calculator, it's going to assume that we're doing it in the mode that the calculator is in. Now let me go ahead for the time being and change this back over to radians. Fly this out, put us back in radians. More or less most of the time when you get into upper level science and engineering, you're mostly going to be working in radian measure. So we'll leave it in radians. And there's one more thing I want to tell you. The calculator has the ability to also work in what we call degrees, minutes, seconds. You might have heard that before when you look at a map. A lot of times you'll see degrees, you'll see minutes, and you'll see seconds. Basically, when you divide it up that way, a degree is equal to 60 minutes, and a minute is equal to 60 seconds. It sort of works like a clock. If that's unfamiliar to you, you can fast forward through this part of the video. It's just something that you may use every now and again. I want to show you how to input that into your calculator. If you wanted to express something in degrees, minutes, and seconds, you can do it as follows. You can go ahead and put, let's say you're going to do 90 degrees. Now to put the degree symbol, there's a little degree bubble right here. Right there. Now let me take this opportunity before I get into degrees, minutes, seconds to show you that I'm in Radian mode now. But because I put 90 with this degree bubble here, it's telling the calculator, yeah, I know you're in radians, but for the purposes of this one little calculation, since I put the degree symbol there, I'm telling you this is 90 degrees. So this comes out to 0 as we might expect. That's very important. If you basically you're overriding the current mode. So it would normally assume it's 90 radians, but because I put the degree bubble there, it understands that it's really degrees. Okay? And if I want to go and do degrees, minutes, seconds, I can do 90 degrees. And if I want to do, let's say, 45 minutes, here's the minute tick mark, which is the second function of the equal sign. And let's say I have 30 seconds, and the second tick mark is the second function on the number 1. So this is 90 degrees, 45 minutes, 30 seconds. And even though I'm in Radian mode, it knows, because I'm explicitly telling it this, it knows to treat this as degrees, minutes, and seconds. So when I hit enter, it's going to go ahead and calculate that and give me the cosine of negative 0.0132, and so on and so on. And so those are the main 3 modes the calculator has. You're mainly going to be working in degrees, radians, or very now and then you might have to put something in degrees, minutes, and seconds. Very unusual for you to need to do that, but you can do it. And by the way, don't get scared off by this. This is basically, instead of 90 point something, this is basically expressed in a different way. 90 degrees, 45 minutes, and 30 seconds. Okay, now before we get into converting these the guys back together, let me go ahead and show you something else. Remember how we're currently in Radian mode and I put 90 degrees and I did an override? Well, you can do the same thing with radians. Let's go back to the mode menu and for the time being stick us back in degrees. So now we're back in degrees. I'll save it. So you notice we're back in degrees. And if I go ahead and do a sine, let's say, if I do, let's do parentheses pi over 2, like this. If I go ahead and evaluate this now, it's going to assume that this pi over 2 is in terms of degrees, which is, 3.14 divided by 2. That's a very small number of degrees. It's going to take the sign. We're going to get some weird decimal because it thinks this is degrees. Now, if I go back in here and notice I wrapped the pi over 2 in its own parentheses. That's very important. I wrapped it in its own parentheses. If I go into the math menu, second function math menu, go into the angle flyout, and come over here. Notice the degree bubble is also an option up here, which is also a second function on the keyboard. We already use that. But this second one here is the radian indicator. So I'll hit enter here. What this is doing is overriding and telling the calculator that this is not pi over 2 degrees, this is pi over 2 radians. That's what the R means. So when I hit enter here, it's going to say, all right, pi over 2 radians is equal to 1. These two things are really important for you to know because it really beats changing back and forth modes of the calculator. I mean, you can accomplish the same thing by switching back and forth all the time, degrees to radians, depending on what you have. But if you're in degree mode and you're working in degree mode for whatever reason, and you need to take a quick calculation in terms of radians, and you don't want to convert this to degrees first, just stick the angle in there, put the little R in by going to the second function math menu. Number 2 is the angle menu, and you got the radian indicator here. Then you can do quick calculations, and the same thing works with degrees. When we go over to this guy and set us back in Radian mode, we're normally going to be doing calculations in radians all day long, but if we need to do a quick calculation in degrees, we can override it by putting the degree bubble there. Alternatively, the same exact thing going into the angle menu and sticking this degree bubble. You know, we actually did that once before, but just for completeness, we'll do cosine. We're normally doing this guy here in terms of radians, but let's say we want to do cosine of 45 degrees. So 45 degrees. I can just do second function, degree symbol, close the parentheses. Normally, if I didn't have this, it would think it's 45 radians, but now it's telling calculator 45 degrees. So 0.707, which is the decimal equivalent of square root of 2 over 2, which is the actual exact answer of the cosine here. Notice I took myself out of exact mode. I'm in approximate mode, so the calculator is trying to give me decimals all the time, which is really helpful when I'm dealing with angles. All right, so we've talked about how to input angles. We've talked about how to override the current angle function that the calculator is in. We've talked about how to do all that. Now let's talk for a minute about how to convert from one angle system to another, because it's really easy to do and it's really useful. The way you need to do that, let's say we're doing, we want to calculate, we want to figure out what pi over 4 is in terms of degrees. You should all know that pi over 4 radians is 45 degrees. But let's say you didn't know that. Let's say we wanted to, let's open a parentheses here, and we'll do pi over 4. Now, we're already in radian mode. We're already in radian mode, so this pi over 4 is going to be assumed to be in terms of radians. Now, if I want to convert it to degrees, I'll just go into the math menu. Number 2 is the angle menu. And if I go down here to the bottom, below number 8, I've got a few different choices here. And what you want is number 9 here, DD. That means convert to degrees. So you hit that, and what this little arrow means is it says take this guy and convert it to DD, which is degree mode. I'm not really sure why there are 2 D's here, to be honest with you, but that's what you need to do. When you hit enter, it's going to stick it as 45 degrees. All right, now let's say, just for giggles, that you were already in degree mode when you did this, when you wanted to do this calculation. Then this wouldn't quite work because it's going to assume that you have pi over 4 degrees, right? So you're going to get the wrong answer. So what you really want to do is tell it, okay, pi over 4 radians convert to degrees. So the way you do that is you got to wrap it up in another set of parentheses here, and you need to tell it that this is a radian measure. So you go to the math menu, number 2. Number 2 is the radian indicator. Now you're overriding the fact that we're in degree mode. You're telling it pi over 4 radians convert to degrees. And it does exactly what you would expect it to do. So I'm really just showing you all of this because it can get confusing when you're in a mode and you get the wrong answer. I'm just telling you this because it can get confusing if you do a calculation and get an incorrect conversion. It might very well be because you're in a certain angle mode already and the calculator thinks that this number that you put in is already in a certain angle. So if you're not sure, then you can always force it to tell it, okay, radians convert to degrees, and that's totally unambiguous. All right, so you would get the answer that you expect there. Now the next thing we want to do is something very similar. Instead of converting radians to degrees, let's convert degrees to radians. And this is a good example because we're actually already in radian mode, so let's go ahead and convert degrees to radians. Let's do 90 degrees. If you do 90 and you want to convert it to radians, you'll have to put the 90 there. You go to the math menu, go to the angle menu with number 2, and go down here to convert to radians, which is this guy down here. So what it's telling you is convert 90 to radians, but this is going to give us the wrong answer because it's going to assume I'm already in radian mode, so it's 90 radians convert into radians. So it's not really going to give us anything that we need because really what we're trying to do is convert 90 degrees to radians, but we're in the wrong degree mode, so you need to override it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So go ahead and take this guy and put a degree bubble there. So now this is very clear. Convert 90 degrees to radians. We hit enter and we get 1.57, which is actually pi over 2 radians. And if I take it out of approximate mode, if I go into the mode menu here and go down just a little bit to approximate and turn it on exact, then you can see that a little bit better. It'll spit it out as pi over 2. It's trying to keep everything exact in this mode. All right, so just keep that in mind. When you're trying to convert from one unit system to the next, you'll always be perfectly protected if you always tell it explicitly what unit of degree you have to begin with and then just tell it to convert to radians or degrees. If you omit this, you just need to make sure that you're already in the proper mode, or else the calculator's not going to give you the right answer from what you're expecting. All right, now the other thing I want to do, let me go and take us out of out of approximate right now. We'll take this out here. I'll go ahead and put us back in exact mode. Okay. And actually what I want to do is take us out of exact mode, because that can get kind of confusing. So let's go back over here and put us back in approximate. All right. So we've converted radians to degrees. We've converted degrees to radians. Now you can also convert any angle you want to degrees, minutes, seconds, like I talked about, DMS. So if you wanted to convert 90 degrees to DMS, to degrees, minutes, seconds, well, you're already in degrees, but if you wanted to do that anyway, you could just go to the math menu. Number 2 is the angle. DMS is down here. This stands for degrees, minutes, and seconds of arc. So we hit number 8, and it'll take you and tell you to go ahead and convert 90 degrees to degrees, minutes, and seconds. Now if you hit enter here, it's not going to be a big surprise. You already had 90 degrees to begin with, so it's just going to give you a pure 90 degrees result. But let's say you wanted to convert some radian measure here. Let's say we wanted to convert something that I wasn't quite sure of. What if I wanted to do pi over 8? Pi divided by 8. So if we wanted to convert pi over 8 radians to degrees, minutes, and seconds, we'd go in the math menu, we'd go to the angle menu, number 2, and we'd do DMS, degrees, minutes, seconds. We'll hit number 8. So what it's saying is convert pi over 8 angle to degrees, minutes, and seconds of arc. Notice that I'm currently in radian mode, so I don't really have to specify anything. I don't have to put the little R there, because it's going to know that this is radians, so that's what I want. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm going to hit enter, and it'll tell me that this is 22 degrees and 30 minutes of arc. So it's it's doing a pretty useful conversion. You can do it by hand, but if you ever have a need to go back and forth between radians to degrees, minutes, seconds, you can go and do that. Now if you wanted to convert this instead of to DMS, just as a comparison, just as a sanity check, if you could go into the math menu here, angle, instead of DMS, if you wanted to convert that pi over 8 to DD, then you could do that, and you would get, instead of 22 degrees 30 minutes, you would get 22.5 degrees. And that's really the difference between the two modes. When you're talking about normal angles, everyday angles that we talk about, 22.5 degrees makes a lot of sense, because it's basically 22 degrees plus another half a degree. That's what that is. DMS is really just another way of saying the same thing. It's converting the fractional part into minutes of arc and seconds of arc. If you don't quite know what that is, that's okay. It's kind of a thing that you might use every now and again. But it really relates to map coordinates and things like that. Astronomy uses that a lot. The coordinate system of the sky uses minutes and seconds of arc. So it's something that, certain branches of math and science might use a little bit. Most of the rest of us in engineering are not going to use this too much. We'll just deal with regular old degrees and regular old radians, which we've talked about how to convert. Okay. One more thing I'll show you is if you had to convert degrees, minutes, seconds off to degrees, you could also do that here. Let's say we wanted to go backwards and convert this guy. Let me clear it. Let me open up a set of parentheses. Let's do 22 degrees and 30 minutes. So I just put 30 and I just put minutes right here. Right? That takes care of doing that for me. And if I wanted to convert that, let's say, to degrees, if I wasn't quite sure what this was equal to in degrees, then I could go into the math menu, angle menu, and I could go down to DD, which is sort of decimal degrees. I bet you that's what the other D is, decimal degrees. You hit this guy here, hit enter, and you get 22.5 degrees, which is exactly what we kind of figured out from this above here. So in this section we've done a lot of really important things. We've talked about the mode menu here for the angle. We've talked about the fact that whatever angle you type into like a trig function or something, the calculator is going to assume that it's in this mode. And if you intend to do a calculation to override the current mode, instead of going, you could go to the mode menu, you could change the mode of the calculator and then do your calculation, that's fine. But if you wanted to override it, you go into the math menu and you go into the angle menu, and then you select and override and tell the calculator if you're operating in degrees or radians for that one particular calculation. If you want to convert between degrees, radians, then you have these functions down here to basically tell it to convert to decimal degrees or convert to radian measure. You can also convert to DMS, which is degrees, minutes, seconds, and of course you can convert to the gradient measure system also, but that's something that's not used too often, so I didn't really cover it here, but it functions exactly the same way. I'm Jason. I hope you've learned something from this lesson. Play around with it a little bit. Just make sure that whatever you type in, if you're not going to explicitly tell the calculator what unit you have, just make sure whatever you type in matches the current mode of the calculator. That's really the biggest gotcha for this. That's what a lot of people do wrong. Get the wrong answer, upset about it. It's because you got to know what the calculator is expecting to receive, and you might need to override it in those cases when you try to do a calculation in different modes, flip-flopping back and forth.